Okay, so I need to break this down because it's something that keeps on repeating in different forms and people really do not question it. There's this underlying idea that femininity automatically equals weakness, and it shows up everywhere. It's how people talk, how they joke, how they insult each other, even how they praise things. Like anything associated with a woman or femininity is treated like it's less than. And it's not always said directly, but it's implied constantly. And after a while, it just becomes normal fucking language. Like, when you actually slow it down, it doesn't make logical sense at all because being a woman isn't a weakness category, it is just a different set of traits that get interpreted through a biased lens. And one of the biggest things is how emotion is treated because women are constantly labeled as, oh, too emotional. But emotional literally just means responsive. It means you're processing what's happening internally instead of shutting it down, like men are taught to do at a young age. So when they see a woman reacting strongly, it becomes, oh, she's reacting. When she's expressing that she's hurt, it becomes, oh, she's dramatic. But when she sets boundaries with emotion, it becomes, oh, she's unstable. But men doing the exact same thing often gets framed differently depending on the context. A man in anger is seen as intensity or dominance, while a woman in anger is seen as, oh, she's fucking crazy as shit, you know? Like, so the exact same human emotion gets assigned value based on gender. And that is where the distortion is, because emotion itself is neutral, it's just the interpretation of a gender that is biased. And women being more emotionally expressive is not a defect, it's actually tied to communication, caregiving, intuition, and social awareness. Literally, all things are literally necessary for human connection and survival. So calling that weak is more like misunderstanding what emotional intelligence even is. And then there's how strength is defined, because society tends to default strength to physical ability. Like how strong you are, how much you can lift, how aggressive you are, how much pain you can push through without showing it. And that model naturally fits masculinity more because of biology and social conditioning. But the problem is it gets treated as the only form of strength that matters. So when women display endurance in different ways, emotional regulation, multitasking under pressure, caregiving, long-term resilience, etc., it doesn't get categorized as strength at all. It just gets seen as normal or expected. So women are literally performing strength in multiple ways, but it's not labeled as such. And then the narrative becomes men are strong, women are weak, which is just incomplete because it ignores half the definition of strength entirely. And then there's physical endurance, because women literally go through cycles that affect them physically and mentally on a regular basis, and it's just built into life. No pause, no exception, it's just expected to be managed quietly. And when men are exposed to even simulated versions of that pain, the reaction is often shock, not because they are weak, but because they're not conditioned to it, which is the key point, because people underestimate what they're not personally forced to adapt to. So when women handle it repeatedly, it gets normalized instead of acknowledged. And that creates this weird imbalance where endurance is invisible when it's consistent, because people only recognize struggle when it's unfamiliar. And this is where language plays a bigger role than people think, because words shape what we associate with power. Like saying, he has balls, for bravery, except if you're someone who is seen as so-called weak, you are suddenly a pussy? Like, what? So, like, masculinity becomes symbolic for courage, while femininity becomes symbolic for insult. And neither of those are actually logical connections. They're cultural shortcuts that get repeated often because they're turned into default language. And once language locks in a pattern like that, it influences perception automatically. So even if someone doesn't consciously believe women are weak, the language that they use still reinforces the framework subconsciously. And that is why it sticks so deeply. And we are not even close to being done, because there's also how women are perceived visually, because appearance plays a massive role in how women are judged before anything else. Before intelligence, before personality, there's already a layer of evaluation happening based on looks, body type, femininity level, desirability, and that filter affects credibility. It all stacks together. So even if a woman is extremely capable of something, she still has to pass through that initial perception barrier. Meanwhile, men are more often evaluated on role or status first. Like, what they do, what they provide, what position that they have. So the starting point is already different, and that difference changes how authority is assigned in everyday interactions. The next layer I'm talking about is sexualization, because women's bodies are constantly framed in ways that reduce them to physical parts instead of full people. And it's not just attraction, it is commentary, expectation, and object framing. And even the way intimacy is described can become aggressive or dominating in language, like, oh, I'm gonna bang her, or I'm gonna smash, or some shit like that, you know what I mean? Which shifts the idea of sex anyway from connection and toward control or consumption. So when that becomes the cultural default, it affects how women experience being seen in general, because even neutral interactions can feel loaded with awareness of how they're being perceived. And that changes comfort, safety, and self-expression over time. And you can really see these patterns in movies as well, like Barbie, a story that is very clearly about women being seen, judged, limited, and boxed into expectations. It's exploring identity, perception, and how femininity is treated in society. But even then, conversations around it so often shift toward male validation or male interpretation of the message. Like, the focus slips away from what it's actually about. And that itself kind of proves the point of the film. And then even Mulan, the whole movie, literally, because she's placed in a system where women are expected to be quiet, obedient, and supportive in the background. She's told to stay in her role, stay silent, and uphold family expectations, and instead she enters a completely male-dominated environment. She trains under conditions that are not designed for her. She adapts, she survives, she excels, and at first she's dismissed purely because of gender assumptions, but over time, she becomes one of the strongest fighters there, not because she became a man, but because the assumption that femininity equals weakness was wrong from the start. And that's really the point. Women are not weak. Femininity is not weakness. What exists is a system of interpretation that constantly underestimates, mislabels, or reduces femininity traits into something negative. And when in reality, those traits are just different forms of strength that don't always fit the physical or dominant framework people are used to. And once you separate perception from reality, the whole hierarchy of strong versus weak starts to collapse, because it was never about being actually objective in the first place. It was just repeated long enough to feel like it was.